Hey everyone, welcome back to Philosophy for Flourishing, the show where we explore principles and practices for living the best, most fulfilling life possible. Today I talked to entrepreneur, investor, and author John Chisholm. So let's dive right in. If you enjoy the show, I hope you'll subscribe and leave us a rating.
So I'm so happy to have you. You are, of course, an entrepreneur and author of this great book, Unleash Your Inner Company on entrepreneurship. But today we're going to talk about another topic. I'm eager at some point, perhaps, to talk to you about this book and some of your ideas on business. Um, but we met recently at a really interesting conference in Medellin, Colombia, where you gave a presentation on holistic diversity in higher education. And so before we dive in, let's just back up and talk a bit about your background as it relates to diversity in higher ed. How does an entrepreneur even get interested and involved in this topic?
Well, I've been involved with MIT ever since I was an undergraduate there in the 1970s. After I graduated, I became involved in the Alumni Association, the head of our local club here in Northern California, which is a very active club, as you can imagine, being in Silicon Valley. And I just took on more and more responsibility with alumni activities and joined some visiting committees, and eventually was named president and chair of the Worldwide Alumni Association from 2015 to 16. And I joined the board of trustees, what we call the MIT Corporation. And I've just finished 6 years on the corporation, ending June 30th. And it's been really a wonderful experience to get to see up close and to be part of up close the leadership and governance of a major U.S. research institution. So that, in a nutshell, is how I've become involved with MIT and more broadly higher education.
And not just any major US research institution, but one in which you have a good amount of spiritual equity because you, of course, went there. And am I right? Didn't your mother also work there at some point?
Yes, she did. In fact, I like to say that MIT has been part of my life and my sister's life since before we were born, because Mom was a librarian there until I was 5 years old, when we moved from Boston down to Florida. And so, of course, I'd heard about MIT my whole life and idolized it. So I guess it wasn't too surprising that I tried to get into MIT. It might have been a surprise that I got into MIT. I came from a small town in Florida. I believe was the first person from Jupiter High School to go to MIT, and I'm the first male in my family to get a bachelor's degree. I was preceded only by my mom, who got her bachelor's degree the same year I graduated from high school, and my sister, who's a couple of years older than I am. So anyway, it was a great thrill to actually go there and be part of it. And it was really hard. I like to say that I started in the bottom 20% of the bottom 20%, because only 20% of the 1,000 incoming freshmen took introductory calculus. And I'm sure that 80% of those had at least some calculus. But I hadn't had any because our high school didn't even offer it. So hence the bottom 20% of the bottom 20%. But I just stuck with it, and if you stick with anything, as I say in my book, with passion and perseverance over the long haul, you'll eventually get to wherever you want to get to. And anyway, I made it through. And
Well, you're a huge inspiration on that front. And of course, the MIT blood runs deep. I guess we could say you've got a lot of spiritual equity in MIT, and you want MIT to continue to grow and go in the right direction. And at some point, this idea of diversity, as it has with all of higher ed at this point, came onto the scene and you were met with this sort of scepter of, okay, what do we do? And, do we engage with this as a problem at all? What is the need for diversity here? So could you talk a bit about the sort of genesis of this problem where you were at MIT, and how you began to engage with it?
Sure. Well, first of all, diversity is a really good thing. It diverse ideas, lived experiences, people help bridge gaps between different populations. They diverse ideas are what lead to innovation. They test our thinking and improve our thinking and sharpen any debate. A institution of higher education like MIT or any university should be vitally interested in diversity, in my view. One of the visiting committees I served on is libraries, and at one of our visiting committee meetings, the longest single session in that meeting was on diversity and inclusion. But the focus was entirely on people of color, people of different sexual orientations, people who are differently handicapped, differently abled. And I appreciated that because I grew up in the 1970s, deeply closeted as a gay man. And to see MIT so embracing of people of different sexual orientations today is just tremendously gratifying. But at the same time, I wondered if or how included at MIT people of different political beliefs, conservative Christians, Republicans, Trump supporters would feel at MIT or in the libraries. Would we even hire such people knowingly? And there was no answer. And that led me on a path of exploring this issue and trying to find out to what extent people were who were different from us in ways different from what we normally think about, how included and they would feel at MIT. And that led me to this framework that I call holistic diversity, encompassing not just personal and identity elements, which is what we normally talk about with diversity, race, gender, sexual orientation, but also cognitive and intellectual diversity, of which there are myriad dimensions, and myriad more related dimensions. And in aggregate, these millions of dimensions of diversity characterize the entire individual, and that's what I call holistic diversity. The dimensions of cognitive and intellectual diversity include such things as risk aversity versus risk neutrality, long-term versus short-term time perspectives, introvert versus extrovert, transactional versus relationship-oriented when dealing with other people, not to mention intelligence itself. For the myriad other dimensions, there are such things as zip code, tonsorial and sartorial preferences, how we like to dress and have our hair cut, clubs joined, avocations, sports, uh, household income, things that Richard Dawkins, the evolutionary biologist, might refer to as one's extended phenotype. So all of these together comprise what I call, or are comprised by holistic diversity. And so that's the approach that I've been promoting and at MIT and elsewhere. And I'm just thrilled that this idea has gotten so much traction. I've been invited to talk about it to the San Francisco Economic Roundtable, the Global Federation of Competitiveness Councils, the conference you and I met at many other universities besides MIT, where I had a chance to present it to the Board of Trustees and elsewhere. So that in a nutshell is holistic diversity.
You mentioned many factors and components of holistic diversity there, but earlier when you were talking about it, you said a couple times, you mentioned the importance of the diversity of ideas. And I'm wondering how much of these other components of diversity come down to differences in that diversity of ideas. Is this diversity of ideas, in your view, sort of the fundamental, or the thing that integrates many of these others?
Well, it's very important and neglected, but by no means the only one that's important and neglected. For example, let's take geography. If you sort the undergraduates at MIT by state, the 25 more heavily represented states are 3 times as likely to send students, graduating high school seniors, to MIT per capita than are the least so inclined U.S. states. And if you look at the states that are so underrepresented, they're mostly rural states. And of course, we don't do any recruitment or outreach to these states at all, for 2 good reasons. One is the best high schools in the U.S. tend to be in cities, and it's more efficient to recruit through cities or in cities than it is in rural areas, because you can make contact with so many more high schools and so many more students at one visit, or one alum can have many more contact with them. And so to understand this problem, you really have to look at the admissions pipeline. And there are 4 stages of any university admissions pipeline: outreach, applications, admits, and enrollments. The outreach that we do, the applications that we receive, the those who are apply, who are admitted, and then those who are admitted enroll. Well, the rural states do very well on a proportional basis on the admissions. So believe it or not, students from rural states are actually more likely per capita of those who apply to be admitted to MIT. Where the shortfall happens is in the other 3 stages, 1, 2, and 4, the outreach, the applications, and the enrollments. So we don't outreach to rural states, not very many students apply, and of those who are accepted, a lower than average proportion enroll. And in my paper, I talk about why this is. First of all, because there's no outreach, you have to be really interested in, engaged with science and engineering or technology to know about MIT and to want to apply, especially if your peer group is not particularly applying. So the ones who do apply are better than average candidates. On the admission side, the application side, that's pretty much driven by outreach. And on the enrollment side, there's some evidence to indicate that folks from rural states don't feel comfortable at MIT through campus visits, through interactions, as, say, students from urban areas do. And so even those who are admitted are less likely to enroll. And what this brings us to is the fact that students from these states are different not just geographically, but they're also different intellectually, economically, socially, and culturally, and politically. Overall, incomes tend to be lower in these states. They have different cultural values. They tend to be more socially and conservative, fiscally conservative, and the states tend to be more red than blue. And in fact, if you sort the 50 U.S. states from red to blue, you'll see that and plot the percentage of eligible high school seniors who end up at MIT. The curve is concave upward. It's like a geometric curve, which means that there's a real extreme bias towards blue states from red states. So all of this concerned me because it means we're not getting the intellectual diversity and diversity of values at MIT that we could be getting. And again, holistic diversity is intended to help address this. Why is it that we have such a propensity to focus just on race and gender, the really visible characteristics, rather than the less visible intellectual and cognitive characteristics of an individual? Well, to use the words of economist and psychologist Daniel Kahneman, it's a matter of thinking fast versus slow. It's easy to recognize someone's race and gender. It's much harder and takes work to get a sense for what someone is all about and their character, which are not so very visible. But it is the same bias and inclination, this thinking fast, that drives gender and racial discrimination. And so we don't want to do that. We want to look at the whole person. The folks from the rural states that are lower income, predominantly red, that I mentioned, that are the most underrepresented segment at MIT, I refer to as the other half of the U.S. The other because they are not us, like it or not, and half because they represent approximately half of the U.S. population. And they are completely invisible on campus with no advocacy at all. I did a survey informally of that I talk about in the paper that included one of our deans to ask, if you could segment the U.S. population any way you wish, which segment would you guess is most underrepresented? Well, the segment that most people mentioned were Native Americans. Well, according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Native Americans, including Alaskan Natives, represent 1.7% of the U.S. population. This is nowhere near as underrepresented as the other half of who represent about half of the U.S. population. And I dare say this issue is much less pronounced at MIT than it is at most of our elite universities, because MIT is a science and engineering focused institution, and we have more objective criteria to select people, students, and faculty and staff too. The technical skills that are required that tend to be more independent of one's geography or political and cultural leanings. There is no such science and engineering focus at most of the elite universities, and so I dare say the problem is even more pronounced there. So those are some thoughts.
Why think of diversity at all? Why not just select the candidates who are best, who do best on the sorts of tests and things that are important to get into an elite school like MIT? What are the sort of university level consequences of just focusing on merit, or alternatively, the traditional status quo view of diversity?
Well, John, I think a very viable approach that needs to be at least investigated is this: just choose students, as you say, based on merit, based on the strength of their skills by whatever are the most objective measures that we have. And we've got lots of measures now because MIT's been around for 150 years. We can see which students are likely to be successful, to graduate, which ones are likely to drop out or change to an easier major, or ultimately not be successful in life, or not be participating alumni. Whatever performance metrics a university would like, there's plenty of data to judge that. And then try to assess the diversity of the resulting class. And if it seems sufficient, great, we're done. We don't have to focus on diversity in the selection process. If there are dimensions along which it's not adequate, then we need to work. And obviously the current system is not working because, as I've mentioned, the half of the US population is being neglected. And so here we invest millions, tens of millions, to ensure diversity, and yet fully half of the US population is being neglected. So I like the idea of focusing on whatever objective criterion we have first, and then assessing the diversity to see if it meets whatever our expectations and requirements are. And if it does, we're done. And that way we don't compromise our standing, and we also don't harm applicants through mismatch. Let me explain. When I came out as a gay man fairly late in life, in my mid-30s, prior to that, if I was selected or chosen or elected to a position, I knew it was because of what I had contributed or accomplished. Now that I'm out as a gay man, I can't be so sure. Was I selected or elected or chosen for this position because of what I've contributed or accomplished or my track record, or just because I'm gay. No one should be subject to that indignity and uncertainty. There is lots of evidence to indicate that people who aren't qualified for elite universities actually have worse life outcomes than folks who were not so selected but went to less elite universities that were a better fit with their skills or capabilities. So that's something that we need to be aware of and sensitive to, the burden we're placing on underqualified candidates.
Just a comment, and then I'd like to see if you have some thoughts on this. But going back to this idea of selecting people based on merit, it seems as if let's say the outcome desired is people who are qualified to go on to have flourishing careers and to do really valuable work. It seems as though the one thing that we would need to know there is whether or not they have the merit to get into this elite university and to do the type of work that we're asking them to do. And then later assessing the data of whether or not this was a diverse group. Did merit do the job of giving us diversity? It seems as if, as you're pointing out now, there are so many variables, given that each person is his own person, each individual is his own individual. There's so many ways to parse that data that almost by any standard, you could look at the data and say, well, along these lines, it's not diverse. So just a comment. Do you have any thoughts in response to that?
I do think at some point in the future, maybe 10 years from now, we'll look back at the way that we admit students to universities and view it as extremely archaic. So we look at each each applicant one at a time, and we make an assessment about that each admit one at a time, and then hope that the resulting pool of students that we've admitted will comprise a really suitably diverse and capable population. But that really unnecessarily constrains the whole process. What you'd really like is to be able to look at every subset of all of the applicants in aggregate and choose the best performing subset that you have the ability to admit. In MIT's case, we're limited to 1,000 freshmen for a variety of constraints that have to do with the physical campus and so forth I could talk about. But we get typically 7 times as many applicants as that. And then look at them in aggregate and choose the best subset that's consistent with how many people we can accept. But it's impossible for we humans to deal with so many variables like that at once. And so that clearly requires AI. So AI can do a much better job of ensuring diversity. This well-programmed AI would not have overlooked the other half of the U.S. population in choosing a student body like we do, what we do currently. The good research and concerns have been raised about bias in AI, and the MIT Media Lab has started the Algorithmic Justice League, which focuses on making AI approaches fair or fairer. And but this is the direction I think we will need to see college admissions go in the future if we're going to achieve true diversity. Of course, some people oppose the use of AI techniques in college admissions precisely because we lose the ability to put our thumb on the scale. But that's all the more reason to do it, in my view.
So you've been heartened by the response to this idea of holistic diversity at several places where you've presented it, one of those places being MIT. What was MIT's response? Is there any sort of action that they were taking on the basis of your ideas on holistic diversity?
Well, I think the ideas are still permeating throughout the institute, and I am pleased with the reaction so far. The current way of doing things is deeply entrenched. There are some people who aren't shy at all about saying, we don't want students from red states at MIT. We don't want Trump supporters at MIT, or we don't want conservative Christians at MIT. But that's just not acceptable to have that mindset, especially in this day and age. I talk in the report about how higher education is unwittingly helping drive growing U.S. polarization, because feeling left behind in education is one of the key drivers of polarization. And I think if people don't feel like they're getting a fair shake because of their geography or culture or political leanings, that is unfair to them, and it also hurts MIT or any other higher education university by losing out on the diverse perspectives that those people bring.
Any knowledge of other universities that are putting these ideas into practice just yet, or is it still sort of similarly permeating elsewhere?
Well, I think the university that has distinguished itself the most for not focusing just on personal and identity dimensions, but trying to be broader and thinking about diversity is the University of Chicago. And they've promoted the Chicago principles, which I think are well worth aspiring to. I won't try to encapsulate them here, but just look them up and you'll find them online. A Heterodox Academy consists of faculty, students, staff from universities around the country that promote diverse thinking on campuses, and I think their work is well worth being aware of and supporting. So those are two.
Well, I commend you for urging universities to go beyond the typical dimensions of affirmative action and focusing merely on race and gender. I agree with you that this is definitely adding to polarization in the U.S. Any other thoughts on this topic before we sign off for today?
I would say we don't like to think of ourselves as racist. But if we don't include the other half in our diversity and inclusion initiatives, it will be because they are of the wrong skin color.